So we are having our third and last panel, which will be on institutions. And I'm going to take the privilege of being moderator just to say a few things by way of mildly substantive organization. In the US government, you might have noticed a few years ago, there was a famous icon called the food pyramid, which helped provide people with information about what a nutritious meal would look like. But if you look at the food pyramid, it's extremely confusing. There's a guy who's, or maybe it's a woman, who's walking up to some white tip. And is that thinness? Is that heaven? And then there are foods mushed together, and the walking person has no shoe, and one of the foods actually looks like a shoe. And is it nutritious to eat a shoe? It's a very confusing thing, the food pyramid. So we got rid of the food pyramid and replaced it with a simple icon called the food plate, which has basically advice, which is nutritional advice. If you make half your plate fruits and vegetables, kind of on the right track. And I have a friend in the US government who called me after a complicated international negotiation and said it went really well. And I asked how come, and the response was, plate, not pyramid. And what this meant was, if you talk to people in terms of the pyramid in a way that's complicated and vague and ambiguous, you often get stymied and nothing happens. But if you give them clarity and say that here's an idea, which O-Power is doing, which Facebook does in multiple occasions, Twitter too, then you get a response which may be agreeable and won't at least be, I don't know what you're talking about, so I'm going to do something else. So I think a primary lesson of the first two panels, certainly the second, is the importance of plate, not pyramid. With respect to social influences, which has naturally been the dominant theme, and we'll talk about that a bit today, I have a little study which connects with the first and second panel, and which I think has large lessons. It's not my own, it's from a few years ago by Matthew Salgonick and Duncan Watts, and it involved music downloads. And in the control condition, people were asked what songs they'd like to download in the standard fashion. After they hear a little snippet, they can download what they like. In the experimental conditions, and there were a bunch of them, meaning there were different subgroups, people could see just serendipitously, virtually, who in their particular, how many downloads were made by those in their particular subgroups. And we could do an experiment like this in a room or on the web anytime, just sorting people into groups of several thousand and seeing who serendipitously in each group downloads which songs. Now you might ask yourself, would it be that the subgroups would look, in terms of the popularity of the music, like the control, so that quality would win? Would it be that in the 7 or 8 subgroups, the songs that did great or well or adequately or badly in the control condition would also do well in the social influence conditions in the subgroup worlds where you could see the previous downloads? Got the setup? What actually happened was that the serendipitous fact of who were the early downloaders and what were they downloading mattered hugely. While the best songs were never flops, and the floppest songs were never best, aside from that, just about anything could happen. Which is a signal, I think, about the unpredictability of cultural and political outcomes because of their frequent dependence on the serendipitous movements of early participants in the action. And if this suggests, for example, that the Mona Lisa is serendipitously the most famous painting in the world, and that certain successful products and politicians are serendipitously that, and could, without some supportive action at crucial stages, have been like a bunch of less successful analogs, that's a potential lesson. And while this theme about serendipity and unpredictability wasn't in italics or bold in the first session, which emphasized social influences and what goes viral. I think it is a potential lesson of what was said. Now, the sibling to unpredictability is something like, I'm not sure what the best term for it is, but something like malleability is the sibling to it. So in the music download study, if truthfully some songs are getting popular early, or if experimentally the researchers say incorrectly that some songs are getting downloaded a lot early, then you can create winners. So there's a degree of unpredictability, a high degree, but there's also some malleability. And some of the studies we discussed involving organ donation and voting behavior, with the remarkable finding that knowledge of which of your friends voted with their faces increases voting substantially. That shows there's an opportunity there. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is defaults and privacy, which is something we will spend some time on today. We've discussed a bit the power of default rules in multiple domains. With respect to energy use, for example, in Germany, there are 2 communities that show high degrees of use of green energy, only 2 in all of Germany. And it's not that those 2 are particularly green. It's that the default rule favors green energy. People have to opt out. Over 90% of people in those 2 communities are using green energy. It's because that's the default. In other places in Germany, well over 90% aren't using the green energy. It's because green energy isn't the default. The default rule is immensely powerful. Now, the discussion at the end of the previous panel suggested a choice, a pervasive choice, between a default rule of a certain kind and active choosing. So in many domains, some of them not really visible because we're not focusing on them, we are defaulted into something by a private or public institution, or alternatively, we're asked to make a choice. So most of your cell phone settings have default rules that you can change. Some of them you have to make an active choice at some point. And this is a pervasive fact of interaction with private and public institutions. Typically, default rules, when they're in place, and if you think about the next day and your interactions with other institutions, default rules are everywhere. They're part of the choice architecture of life. Typically, the default rules that we live with are mass, in the sense that they affect all members of the relevant population. With respect to organ donation, the default rule is you're not enrolled. You have to sign up. That applies to everybody. But in some domains, and increasingly it's the case, we have an alternative to mass default rules or active choice, and that is personalized default rules, where on the basis either of your own past choices or on the basis of the choices of people relevantly like you, a default rule can be chosen for you that's likely to fit your situation, but that you can alter if you don't like it. So the suggestion is the omnipresent choice between the default rule and the active choice, something that is made very frequently, now has a competitor, which is a personalized default rule particularly tailored to you. This obviously itself raises questions about privacy, and let's just notice that that problem could itself be solved either through active choosing or through personalized default rules for you based on your privacy choices. If it's known that you are very pro-privacy, you could be defaulted into privacy protective defaults. Or if we don't know anything about your attitude toward privacy, you could be forced or requested to choose a privacy setting without being defaulted. Okay, the last note here on the privacy issue and defaults is that there's a very complicated question on which there's little academic literature right now about the appropriate rules with respect to social networks, either default rules or mandatory rules, given what we know about human behavior. And here's one of the complexities. If people know not about you in particular, but about what you like and choose. They don't need to know your name or anything about you. All they need to know is restaurants, movies, whatever. If people know that, say they're your friends or people on Twitter, if they know that, they gain from that. There's information in that, as Sendel suggested. There's informational content by virtue of the choices and preferences and judgments of others. A highly privacy protective regime, which may be in the end the right way to go, has a potential downside, which is it deprives the public of information not about you in particular, but of data about what other people like and do. And while the personal identifiability of that data should certainly be in the hands of the person, presumptively, there's a complicated trade-off between privacy protection, which is a very important value, and information flow, which is also a very important value. And I hope I've said enough to suggest that insufficiently considered judgments about the trade-off between those two might compromise something that democratic societies hold dear. In an era in which, first, there's an acutely important value in protecting privacy, and in an era in which, second, think of the first and second panels, it's acutely important and kind of terrifically promising to provide people with information not about names, but about what other people are doing and liking. That can, in the best cases, that can save lives. Okay, this panel is called The Role of Institutions, and that obviously relates to what I've just said. Our first speaker from Facebook we're privileged to have is Elliot Schrage, who has worked in detail on these questions.
Thanks, Cass. I'm hoping this is on. Helps if you turn it on. I don't know if that's good. Let's do it that way. This is for right-handed people. So I'm actually not going to start out talking about the institutional privacy issue because it's clear that we're going to have a lot of conversation about that and there may be some interest. The reason I'm here and the reason I'm so interested in this conversation is because of really the point that Cass ended on. And that is, I really believe that so much attention has been placed on the concerns and the risks of data, and there's been an insufficient attention and focus on the opportunities that it presents. So what I'd like to do, and I'll touch on this in some of the remarks that I make, but I want to make sure people understand and appreciate how we view the opportunity that that this technology and social networks present. And to do that, I want to go back just a couple of steps. First, I have to ask, I do believe in audience participation, and particularly since we're here at Harvard. Facebook just celebrated its 9th anniversary just a couple days ago. Is there anyone here who was on Facebook, let's say, 5 years ago? Excellent. Okay, well, gosh, this is great. 6 years ago. Wow. 7? Wow, were you here? Okay. 8 years ago? Wow. 9 years ago? Close. Okay. So the reason I say that is, well, then my next set of questions is, if you remember the beginning of Facebook, certainly I've only been at Facebook for 5 years, but when I got there, Facebook was viewed as this silly tool where people would poke each other and throw sheep. And I remember distinctly being a part of conversations where we would say, we think this technology, not just Facebook, but these technologies of connection are creating a revolution. And people would laugh because they would say, oh, it's a revolution of throwing sheep. And then we had to stop saying that after the events in the Middle East and the Arab Spring, because it really was demonstrating the revolutionary potential of these technologies. And I think that it's important to realize that the vision, or to recognize that the vision of what we think we're doing is to unlock the potential opportunities that connections, the knowledge of connections, the knowledge of social power, the power of friends, as it were, can really create for governance and public institutions. So again, since we did just do the 9th anniversary, a couple of the statistics, other people have referenced it. So Facebook, just talking about us, we have more than 1 billion people around the world who use this technology. 600 million people come back every day. Around the same number now access Facebook regularly on mobile devices. Mobile is now used more widely on Facebook than desktop as an ability to access your friends and communities. What that means is people, because as Sarah and others have pointed out, we have helped people map out online the social graph of their relationships and their interests. We've helped them do it, and we can talk more about this, in a manner that lets them share what they want to share when they want to share. So there is really quite consciously personalized privacy control. There is a source of a collection or a presentation of data based on what people are interested in and what they're sharing. And most importantly, for the purpose of this conversation, is in 2007, we created a platform that enabled anyone to tap into that social graph, to feed into those powers of connection and to the friends that are created and the networks that exist. And from my perspective, for the purpose of this conversation, for the purpose of this conference, I see and we see just extraordinary opportunities for public institutions to leverage this technology to achieve and to advance public goods and collective goods. And you've seen some of, and you've heard about some of the examples today, but I think those are just the hints of what can be done and what needs to be done. So we've seen it with respect to organ donation and medical work. But again, that's just the first step. We saw the glow cap, which I actually hadn't seen before. But Facebook technology or social technologies have the ability to use the social network, and I think it was even suggested, to encourage people to use their to take the medication that they've been prescribed. There's numerous studies have demonstrated how social networks can impact public health issues or personal health issues, from weight loss to smoking to a variety of medical related issues. With O-Power, we've seen it on energy. With voting, we've seen it in governance, but again, it's just the beginning of the opportunities for people to participate in new ways. There's been a fair amount of discussion about the extent to which census or other related data collection or data work can be done through these new technologies rather than essentially inventing the wheel every 10 years. The opportunities have not really even begun in areas such as finance, and in my opinion, not nearly as far in education. The power of social networks in promoting education, in improving the quality of education, and highlighting educational opportunities. One of the little hints that we've identified that people have done as a hackathon project at Facebook is the possibility for promoting peace. We have something called peace.facebook.com. Operates on the theory that people who make connections across boundaries of hostility are less likely, can through their actions create a greater likelihood create a lower likelihood of conflict or of armed conflict. No idea if it's actually going to happen. It's the idea, though, that these online connections can have offline consequences, even in areas like that. Now, I have no idea, honestly, which of these are good ideas, which of these are bad ideas. And I think the reason I'm here is I think now is the time for us to begin to explore how these opportunities can get realized. And so I think the institutional imperative, and I'll end on sort of two areas. One is, how can public institutions promote this? And what are the things they can do to prevent it's happening faster. I think the opportunities for government to intervene, to be helpful, are numerous and profound. All of the areas that I've talked about are traditionally functions of government. We've seen government play a tiny role in fostering the use of technologies like ours and platforms like ours to advance social, collective, public good objectives. And so that can happen through procurement. It can happen through funding technological application development. I would love to see the government policy or program to give awards or seed funding for developers on our platform or others to promote education, health, governance initiatives. We haven't seen that kind of stuff yet even begin. I'd love to see existing institutions of governance adapt to incorporate these tools into their day-to-day functions and operations in a way that hasn't even really begun. And then from the standpoint of avoiding costs, I think that the simplest point to make, and I'll end on it, is we are still very early in this process. We've just exited the era of poking and throwing sheep. It would be a tragedy, and this is to hark back to Cass's point. It would be tragic if we build a regulatory environment today that forecloses the opportunities of these technologies to advance these public objectives before they've even begun. And I'll stop there.
Great. Our second speaker is Mike Luca from Harvard Business School.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So I just wanted to start off by saying, since this is a panel about the interplay between institutions and social media, what I wanted to talk a little bit about is how the government and policymakers should be interacting with a website such as Yelp.com. Started getting interested in Yelp based on the following question. How is it that consumers are learning about product quality in the internet age? So the observation that got me thinking about this was that we just saw this proliferation of consumer review websites. So we could think about Yelp, which is what I'm going to be talking about now, but we could also be thinking about Angie's List, TripAdvisor, and scores of other sites like this. All of these are part of the crowdsourcing movement where anybody could go online, leave a review for virtually no cost, and then other people could go look at these reviews and then have that influence their decision about what movie to see or what restaurant to eat at. Just to kind of motivate a little bit how influential these types of websites are becoming, a few quick search trends. So here's a trend for the word Yelp over time. So we can see that this is really caught on in a very short amount of time. And just to kind of demonstrate that it's not only Yelp we're talking about, here's Angie's List. So funny bump when they went public and then spike back down. Then we see the same type of behavior for TripAdvisor. So we see all of these are kind of becoming popular, at least using Google Trends as a quick proxy. When we look for terms like Zagat, even kind of before Google acquired them, we saw that search for this type of word was on the decline. As was searches for things like Michelin Guide, if you're a foodie and really like kind of the fancy restaurants to go to. And one of the most striking things that I find about something like Yelp is the fact that I looked at, here's a graph of the coverage of Yelp in Seattle. So in a study that I'm going to be describing, I had looked at restaurants in Seattle, Washington, and started to think about, is Yelp actually influencing behavior? To get started on this, it struck me that by the end of the study, which was 2009, that over 70% of restaurants in Seattle were on Yelp. So this seems it's something that has extensive coverage, especially when you kind of compare it to the traditional forms of information that are out there. So surely Yelp isn't the first way to learn about product quality. If you look at Zagat, this is based on another study that was looking at their coverage in LA, roughly 5%. If we look at Seattle Times, we're down to just over 1%. And if you look at the percent of restaurants in Seattle that are on Food and Wine, which is too rich for my blood, but Food and Wine covers less than 1%. So all this is a type of information that could potentially be incredibly valuable, but on the other hand is very noisy, and very little has been known historically kind of about the informational content of this, especially because some of these issues that are coming up about the anonymity of the people who are leaving these reviews, and kind of questions about what's motivating to someone to leave a review, or even are these reviews even real. So to say a little bit about Yelp before I get started, it's a restaurant review website mainly, but if you ask them, they'll say that they do a lot more than just restaurants. They also have shops and barbers and other services too. They have about 84 million unique visitors per quarter. And as I said, anyone could leave a review. When we think about what readers on something like Yelp will see, they'll go online and they'll see the overall rating, so something like 3.5 stars, the number of reviews. Restaurants range from 2 reviews up to over 1,000 reviews. The existing reviews, if somebody really wants to go in and read all the details, and also horizontal attributes. So what do I mean by that? What's the location? What's the cuisine? What time? What are the hours of this restaurant? Just things that people might want to know. To give an idea of what Yelp looks like, here's what you see if you go to the front page of Yelp in Boston. This may be heresy, but here's a list of restaurants around MIT that you'll see if you were to go do a search for $4 sign, $3 sign, and $2 sign restaurants, most of which, again, too expensive for me to bother going to. Then also look for things that are good for dinner. So you'll get this type of list, and as I mentioned, you could see the rating, the number of reviews, and some other information. If you click on these, you could then read each of the individual reviews on Yelp. Why was I interested in Yelp? Yelp is kind of a quirky topic. When I started studying this, people said, oh, is this really something that academics should be thinking about? Well, consumer reviews are important. One of the intellectual reasons I was interested in it is just that this is a new and interesting reputation mechanism that's a little bit different from some of the other things that we've seen out in the marketplace, different from chain affiliation, different from other types of branding. Also, I saw that there are some interesting design questions about what motivates someone to leave reviews on Yelp. So kind of there's this opportunity to redesign these types of sites to improve the content. And finally, and this is something I'm going to be getting at through this talk, is it's actually policy relevant. So there are things that I think one could do with Yelp that could improve the way that we're doing policies that government's spending a lot of money on. Why Yelp in particular? Well, Yelp's a success story, so when we look at the features there, they tend to have relatively high quality reviews relative to other restaurant review websites, and also they have a large volume of reviews. It's just kind of making them very easy to work with to do empirical work. So what does the Yelp data look like that I'm going to be describing? I have the entire history of reviews of restaurants that had ever been written since the start in around 2005, and also all the restaurant characteristics. Well, I wanted to ask this question about, does Yelp matter? So is Yelp something that we should be thinking about? Is this a good channel for influencing behavior? In order to do that, I didn't want to just look at Yelp reviews in isolation. What I wanted to do is pair it up with the way that people are actually acting in the marketplace. So I worked with the Washington State Department of Revenue and constructed a panel of sales for every restaurant that had operated in Seattle over a 6-year span. So kind of covering a pre-Yelp period, a post-Yelp period. Once I had this panel, it's about 3,500 restaurants, and I matched it up with the Yelp data. But then what I wanted to do is look at essentially, is Yelp affecting behavior? One thing you could do is simply look at the correlation between the two, but this actually is very problematic using observational data, because something may have high reviews on Yelp and also make a lot of money just because everybody already agrees that this is a good restaurant. But I wanted to say something more than that and say that this is actually a phenomenon that we should be thinking about. So to kind of overcome this difficulty, I noticed a little quirk on the way that Yelp presents information, which actually is related to people's behavior, and it's rounding. So when we think about how Yelp presents information, they present the average rating, but the average rating is actually not the average rating. If we think about the graph we saw earlier, it wasn't 3.2 stars, 3.1 stars, 3 stars. It was 3.5 stars, 3 stars, 2.5 stars. So what this gives us is restaurants that are very similar end up kind of having very different ratings that are displayed to people. So we could think about a 3.24 star restaurant gets rounded down to 3 stars, and a 3.25 star restaurant gets rounded up to 3.5. So what this gives us is a source of exogenous variation in the ratings that are displayed to people, and that is uncorrelated with all the other stuff that's going on in the marketplace. So we could say now we've really got information that's really just about Yelp and not about everything else, which we could then match back with the revenue data to see, does Yelp matter? So essentially, to get an idea of what I look at in this paper is looking around all of these different discontinuities and estimating what the effect of sales is. And what you see is using this regression discontinuity approach that there is a large effect of Yelp rating on sales, and actually this supports the interpretation that this is a causal effect rather than just a correlation between all the different things that are going on. And something that, so the way that people are using this is actually a few other facts just to keep in mind is that Yelp, what I find in the paper is that Yelp matters more when there are a lot of reviews being written, and Yelp matters less when it's a chain restaurant rather than an independent restaurant. So we have this kind of setting where for independent restaurants, when we think back to the graph of, oh, only 5% of restaurants are in Zagat or only 1% of restaurants are in Food and Wine, restaurants that are relatively unbranded are having the largest impact of Yelp. And restaurants that have a lot of reviews and a lot of new information on there are having the largest impact on Yelp. So this kind of suggests that this is something that we could be thinking about as a way to influence consumers. So bottom line, Yelp works, and depending on the specification, 5 to 9% increase in revenue for independent restaurants. So what about policy? So this is about how social media relates to policy. I want to motivate this with a quick anecdote. Back in the 1990s, Los Angeles decided that they wanted to start identifying restaurants that had better and worse hygiene. So they had all these inspectors that were going around. We could think of people with white coats and gloves. I actually have no idea if they have white coats or gloves, but people going around with checklists and saying, all right, here are the 10 things that we need to inspect a restaurant for, which they then aggregate into a grade, A through F. So they get this grade, and what they decided is, wouldn't it be a great idea to post these grades onto the doors of restaurants? And the results actually were great. What happened is restaurants that were posted with an A ended up making more money than restaurants that were posted with a graded B. And moreover, what they saw is that more restaurants started getting A's overall. So they saw there was a quality effect of this type of posting policy. So a great example of how disclosure could actually work. In fact, they even mapped it back to hospitalizations for foodborne illnesses and found that they decreased in the areas where the posting was mandated. So we can think about this as, wow, this is a great success. Now, fast forward to 2013, does this still seem like the best we could do? Can we do better than this type of mandatory disclosure law? So what I've been doing is kind of resting on this insight that people actually are using Yelp, is working with Yelp and working with a series of cities to say, hey, how can there be, and what's the right relationship between these cities who have all of these inspectors and ratings, and Yelp, who has a platform of people who are all looking to choose a restaurant. So what we've been doing is actually we have 5 cities on board who are actually giving all their hygiene grades to Yelp, who are then in the process of putting it into a format where it'll be displayed on the page with the rating. So when we think about the policy perspective, one thing that cities could do even at a very local level is make their data easily available for private corporations to kind of take up. And a little plug for data.gov. This is actually the type of area where cities are able to just put this stuff up on and have a greater impact. So what do we want to do with that? We're doing a randomized rollout in different places, and ultimately we want to see, does kind of posting on Yelp in 2013 have the same type of effect that posting on a door had in the 90s? But there's more that I think you could do with this. So kind of the obvious thing that you would want to do with this type of data is say, okay, take the data, give it from the government who has it sitting there to private companies who could then post it and disseminate this information to people. But actually, when we think about what optimal disclosure looks like, I think that this is changing as we see this proliferation of new information sources. In particular, when we think about what optimal disclosure looks like, it should depend on the existing information structure. and the existing information structure is changing. So there are a couple of things you might imagine governments doing. For example, they could go and see, well, is Yelp correlated with hygiene grades? It turns out it is, especially for certain observable characteristics. So you could imagine saying, well, let's find the things that people are already learning on Yelp, and let's focus inspectors on areas maybe where there are gaps. Second flavor of thing that you could do using Yelp type data is actually you could predict hygiene performance and potentially even reallocate inspectors. So one thing that I've been doing is working with computer scientists on coming up with text analysis programs to say, all right, well, can we actually use the things people are saying on Yelp to predict when there's going to be another violation? So you could imagine sitting there in the inspection office and saying, well, right now what they do is say, well, let's just randomly inspect restaurants. Maybe we'll vary it a little bit by what the cuisine is. So actually by leveraging the things that people are saying out there, to the extent that there are certain markers of where there's going to be a violation, you might actually want to kind of more efficiently allocate restaurants. So when I look at all of this, so the next step is to see, well, how can we interact with government, feed this back to governments for them to actually use it? But when I look at all of this, the lesson that I draw is that there's a kind of nuanced relationship between governments, and especially governments who are interested in disclosure, and social media. So part of what they want to be thinking about is take all this information and disseminate it to people, make it public. But part of it is, what are the things that they could be learning from social media as well? So thank you.
Great. Next up, batting third, is Alex McGillivray from Twitter, who has, I think, the best nickname of anyone at the conference, AMAC. And
thanks. Although I think Jonathan with Jay-Z is a lot better than that. So both because I'm before Professor Zittrain and before your questions, I'll try to keep this really short. Also being from Twitter, that's sort of what I'm supposed to do. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, I want to pick up where Professor Benkler left off just before he opened the floor up to questions, which was very much around what I think is one of the scariest things about behavioral economics in general, which is that it's this assault on our idea that we have static preferences, that we know what our choices are going to be absent the context of being asked for that choice. And so what Professor Benkler, the question that he posed was, if we know that it's that is really open and up for grabs, then doesn't it put a lot of pressure, and the word he used was moral pressure, on the people who are designing those interfaces. And I think that's definitely true. There's no question that the fact that we, as institutions, in terms of Facebook and Twitter, as governments, the fact that we are there now designing interfaces to try to get people's preferences, to try to allow them to make choices, in the knowledge that behavioral economics will tell us that the choices aren't static, that how we present, what we present, that all of that will be part of what choice is actually made at the end of the day, is a tremendous amount of pressure and of responsibility for each of our companies, and also for the government actors. And I wanted to talk a little bit about one way that this is played out at Twitter. Actually, a decision we made a number of years ago involving the retweet functionality. And how many of you use Twitter, just so I can figure out whether I should go into that? Okay, great. So that's almost everybody, so I'll be very, very light. But retweet is a way of signifying that you want to copy something that somebody else has said and bring it to the people who are followers of you. So essentially a way of spreading information. And one of the important things to Twitter, even from the very beginning, was a thought that it would be good if information flow was a little bit more democratic. That if information flow depended not on who you were or how many people were following you, but also on just the quality of the information. So making that ability to retweet, the ability to pass on good information to your followers and have it propagate throughout the network as easy as possible was extremely important. So we made a change to the interface that changed the way retweets were done, made it so that people didn't have the opportunity to comment as they retweeted, would just push one button and get retweets to go through the system. And that had a profound impact on both how much retweets were used, how they were used, and we think it had a positive impact in that democratization of information flow. And one recent example of that was a guy named Brian Jenner. His second tweet ever from England the other day was of a helicopter crash into a residential building. Was retweeted something like 2,500 times, appeared on the front page of a whole bunch of newspapers. Because he had the important and accurate information, it flowed through the network with incredible ease. And so to think about that, now I used an important example for us, but to think about that as ways of making decisions in terms of interface design across the product on a whole bunch of different levels. We do this when we do privacy controls. We do it when we do ways of for people to propagate information. And it makes it important that we think very specifically about the user within those product decisions, not trying to guess what the user might have in their sort of heart of hearts choice, because behavioral economics really complicates that. But trying to understand, if we were sitting in the user's shoes, how would we want the choice presented? What type of context would we want there? With that, I'll pass it over to Jason.
Over to the person with the best nickname, Jay-Z, Harvard Law School. Known to all.
Thank you very much, and I think I should just pick up right where Alex left off, which is this panel is about the role of institutions and really about the creation of new institutions that mediate the social media with which we're so familiar and have become so enamored. And for that, when I look at the topic of the conference, behavioral economics and social media, when I think of behavioral economics, I basically think of like, who knew? There's some insight that affects the way people work in a way that none of us ahead of time would have thought, but then you're like, wow, who knew? It turns out that we're biased in all sorts of ways we don't recognize, and when it's put right in front of our nose, we can see it for about 10 seconds, and then it's taken away, and we return to the world in which we can be influenced by things we didn't know. And then, as long as that influence is taking place and can be shaped, there is lots of opportunity to shape it in certain ways, such as in the organ donation zone, to achieve certain public policy goals. You know, somebody should write a book about this cat. Right? Anyway, I was a big fan of nudge. That's behavioral economics. Who knew? And social media is harder to encapsulate in a single word or catchphrase, but it's roughly grounded, less exclamatorily, in the idea of peer-to-peer. That somehow you're drawing information, advice, insight from people that are on the same plane as you in some way. Maybe a fellow little guy or little gal that's giving you information about something where normally you would have been going, when I think of the slide from earlier this morning of the radiating star on the left versus the more viral network, at least it seemed more viral to me on the right. It's more of the right when we think of social media, otherwise it's traditional media. And I think there is tension between who knew and peer-to-peer, because the peer-to-peer stuff is, wow, these are strangers, but they might be people that I share something in common with, and we discover that together we can accomplish more, or I'll learn more than I would have from the usual group of strangers, pre-social media, or from the traditional media, which has its own blinkers and biases that I'm well familiar with, but still, before social media, trapped by. So what intermediating institution is it now worth talking about? And back in the early days of the internet, what's so striking is how much of it was what I would call unowned. And by unowned, I mean built by people who would write specifications for a protocol, give it away, not seek to capture any rents from it or intellectual property right, let other people use it, and whoa, everybody gets surprised at the results. Somebody should write a book about this. I don't know who. But wow, that really happens. And this is just from the RFC editor's page. This is a current homepage for the RFC editor. I didn't know Zap Chancery still existed. But it's a page that has the index to the basic protocols that make the internet work. And anybody can set up a server, find any means of connecting it, wire, wireless, some way of modulating that at the physical layer, and now we have a protocol by which anything can join the community of non-nations that is the collective hallucination that is the internet. And you can build on top of that other unowned applications. Electronic mail, unowned. which means there's nobody you can go to if you're getting harassing email writ large to say, like, I would like the email administrator to stop this. There is none. You've got to go server by server, which is also why that spammer can move from one to another one step ahead of you. So electronic mail, instant messaging, the internet itself, and yes, the World Wide Web, all unowned phenomena that meant there was no real solid institution in the middle. The Internet Engineering Task Force is the least institutional institution I can think of in this space, and they steadfastly refused to incorporate or hold elections or even take votes among themselves. Okay, so now fast forward, and I hear Alex saying he acknowledges sort of a responsibility beyond that which a normal company owes to its owners or shareholders, in that when I look at Twitter now, there is an institution called Twitter in the middle. Now, it starts off being essentially as if an unowned application. It's very clear who follows whom, how that works. It's very basic. And the algorithm for displaying tweets on my screen is basically anybody I've followed, when they tweet in chronological order, it appears. Okay, I get that. That means Twitter kind of stays out of it. And in fact, I think has adopted a corporate policy of trying to stay out of that as much as possible, even as governments have wanted to write the email administrator and get it to do something involving disclosing information or blocking stuff. So that's fine, but then it starts getting complicated. So here with the hashtag for this conference, you can see, I should have listened to Tori's advice sooner, but you can see here that the tweets include the top tweets. Not just all tweets, but the top tweets. Now that's disclosed. What is a top tweet? Now it turns out, I think Alex will tell you, a top tweet is one that is without the spam. It's at least intended to be. But you could also see it, how does that move? What's the term of art? Featured. Featured tweets. What makes a tweet a featured tweet, if there were one? You start to get into other relationships where the fact that there is a solid institution permanently in the middle can shape the information flows in exactly the ways that gives somebody like Alex, and I'm sure Elliot and others, pause as they realize the power of being that institution in the middle. Now, that could be used for good. In fact, there is demand that it be used to advance certain goals. This is an old study several years ago by some students at UVA, where they said, you know, the problem with Facebook is it's too easy for outside apps to collect information they don't need when you sign up for the app. And we found that a lot of apps ask for data that they have no business asking for, and Facebook should take steps to see to it that such apps are disapproved of, not allowed on the platform. In other words, use the gatekeeper role in order to make for a better world and prevent people from getting hoodwinked. As soon as you've got that power, you've got choices to make about how you're going to use it, and you become a very important institution in the middle. And just, I think today or yesterday, BlackBerry, and it's part of its reincarnation, has said they have new privacy alerts. So if there's an app that BlackBerry says on the BlackBerry platform is not privacy sensitive, you'll get a little note that's like, don't use this app. Click continue to continue, or don't use to not use this app kind of thing. And again, it's a very important, significant role that the gatekeeper is playing. Now, there are other ways as well. I mean, if I had one kind of tear down this Facebook wall, Mr. Gorbachev moment I could use as an opportunity with Elliot here, it'd be like, yeah, how do I unfriend multiple people at once? I have a hard enough time doing it in the real world, but on Facebook, it turns out, right, it would be very simple to write a page and go through your list and just uncheck the people you don't want to be friends with. If you do this on LinkedIn, like if you basically sneeze, LinkedIn will create a new connection. If you want to get rid of the connection, you have to log in, confirm your password, have a 2-key system like launching a missile. It's basically like that ill-fated Last Resort show just to get rid of a LinkedIn connection. And similarly on Facebook, now we know why this is, right? Because connections are good, but this is an example of a nudge that basically becomes a sharp elbow right into some sensitive part of your body in which you would not want a sharp elbow. And that's the kind of thing where you can see there are going to be pressures, especially when it can be measured, the result of making something easier or harder, that might go as against the autonomy of the user. Now also with constant information flows, there's a chance to continue to temper them even more than just picking out top tweets, say. So on Barnes & Noble, I downloaded War and Peace last summer, slow summer, and here on, I don't know what page it was since there's no pages anymore, but as soon as she heard his voice, a vivid glow nooked in her face, lighting up. What? When the flame of the sulfur splinters nooked by the tinder burned. Like, what is going on here? And it turns out that every time the word Kindle appeared in War and Peace, which it being a long book, a lot, it had been replaced by the word Nook. Okay, so that is the least subtle product placement ever by Barnes & Noble. And I'm sure there's an explanation for it we don't have time for. But it's an example of the way in which the institution in the middle can be shaping things and you're not even noticing. So here's a more constant and real example, one I think is going to catch on. Zappos's content team goes to Mechanical Turk, the human computing sort of outfit, and asks for people to simply look at one product review at a time that's coming from real people. And real people make lots of spelling errors, which means people who do know how to spell often criticize them for it, and then you get a subsidiary argument about spelling. But you also find that people who don't spell well don't have their reviews as respected. Why would I trust your view of your shoe if you can't spell? I'm not sure that's a rational thing, but that's how people tend to think. So Zappos has people fixing the grammar of Zappos's reviews so that when you see them, you are more likely to buy something because you will credit more positive recommendations than negative in the system, the recommendation of the person writing the review. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know, but the fact that it's done without me knowing affects the phenomenon much more. If I knew, I would start not trusting any review, including ones that use words like kindled. I would be like, I don't know, that might have been a substitute from Amazon sponsoring this Zappos review. So it's the kind of thing where we can see that subtle changes in flows could become a commonplace. It'll just become, hey, that's just normal. We fix the reviews before we post them. We do a little touch-up where in your first hearing of it, it might sound like, wait a minute, that was a cue that was valuable to me that I was going to try to use. Now, one of the most provocative examples that has come up today that I think is worth discussing is this amazing experiment with N over 61 million of getting people out to vote. And that is great that people are voting. So now, though, here comes hypothetical time. Hypothetically, what if it turned out that the person running Facebook, I forget his name, but the person running Facebook had certain political commitments such that he wanted to encourage some members to vote and others not to, depending on, oh, I don't know, what music they listen to or what political party or who they like. If you like Mitt Romney, maybe among your things in your feed, I won't encourage you to vote today. Good? Bad? I don't know. Now, I say this is totally hypothetical. And I'm not focusing on Facebook in particular. I'm saying any institution that is intermediating in ways that matter enough to celebrate is in a position to make choices or to be paid or regulated / forced to make choices that then affect outcomes that we thought were peer-to-peer because we thought it was social media, when in fact there are these subtleties from behavioral economics being deployed to get us to go one way or another. And I think we absolutely have to think about a framework for how to account for that. And as the likes of Elliot and Alex are kind of up at night wondering about the power of their platforms, what advice do we give them? Maybe they announce they're not going to take that certain things are beyond, oh, I only want Democrats to do this or only want Republicans. That's the kind of platform I'd love. And when I look at my Facebook newsfeed, thank you, Urs, for reminding me of today's conference. I look at today's feed, that is closer to top than to all. It's a lot of AI helping me get the relevant stuff because, again, I have so many friends, I can't get rid of them. There's a lot of stuff there. If it were just sequential like Twitter, it wouldn't be useful. But there's going to be a lot of secret sauce going into it. How secret does it need to be? And the answer may turn out to be, well, probably pretty secret, because if we let the secret out, then SEO comes to town and all this stuff gets optimized. On the other hand, is it security through obscurity? I don't know. I have very little time, so I'm throwing all this stuff out as quickly as possible. Now, this paper was mentioned earlier today, the surprising power of neighborly advice. Why not to ignore your neighbors as you have been? And yes, it turns out that you can figure out better what somebody's going to do by finding out what his neighbor will do than by finding out, say, what he has done before, what his own expectations are. In fact, I think this is the primary contribution of social science to the world, is what they call the fundamental attribution error, that we normally think is characterological rather than sociological and driven by circumstance. Great, this is another bottling of that. But then I look at sites like Rotten Neighbor, where you can report on your neighbor as a bad neighbor, and then other neighbors can prejudge you before even meeting you on the basis of Rotten Neighbor. Good, bad, more efficient neighborly relations so you know whom to ignore without having to learn the hard way after loaning out something. It's like, yes, this is Flanders, stay away. I don't know. And a colleague at the University of Chicago has proposed that this kind of neighborly app is a great thing, here applied to driving. And the hypothetical grounded in this would be, why not have a little TiVo up-down remote, or a like and, dare I say, unlike or dislike button, another controversy we won't get into here, as you're driving around, and if somebody cuts you off, you can say, I don't like that. And if enough people who are not habitual dislikers dislike you, it might mean that you're a crappy driver, at which point your insurance rate should go up if you opt into it through Progressive Insurance. And then the great karmic wheel will turn. When you are kind, you will get a benefit back, which will also make you less susceptible to road rage when you realize that God is watching, here an intermediating institution, and is able to rectify those moments of disharmony that you see. Until you think about the instance when somebody dares to put a bumper sticker that says, "Go Mitt Romney, go," in the middle of Cambridge, at which point that person might be earning dislikes, not on the basis of driving, but on expressing an opinion. And I see the convergence of the virtual and the real world happening more and more, and less about narrow things, even like driving, and more just about life generally, which is why it's like having a tricorder that will tell you, person by person, whom you should be talking to and whom you can safely ignore. Who are my top strangers kind of thing. And this was an old snapshot from Cyworld. It was all the rage in Korea back in the day. And people would get rated in Cyworld on a constant basis along these 5 fundamental attributes. It's kind of like earth, air, fire, and water: sexiness, fame, friendliness, karma, and kindness. And of course, you would immediately start changing all of your behavior in Cyworld to be able to maximize those things. What happens when, right, you think it's bad people just checking in to get mayorships on Foursquare, or people traveling to places they have no interest in going in order to get the next tier level on frequent flyer programs? What happens when at all times you're not just checking your email or on Foursquare, you're figuring out if your friendliness is above the right level and you're trying to modulate your behavior accordingly? This is sort of nudge gone wild. And we see it happening. This is a fingerprint scanner in British pubs. So classic British thing. When you enter the pub, please scan your fingerprint so that if you have been ill-behaved at other pubs, there's a cookie consortium among the pubs, and they will throw you out before you can even start drinking. And I love how it's hard to see at the bottom. The licensing enforcement officer at the police said, if that's their condition of entry, then those are their house rules. You don't have to go in. And now you have a world in which these rating systems that can be so powerful for a restaurant can end up being something that makes us think about our own lives in new ways. And we see it starting. This is a little known, I think, but laudable program of Facebook, where they actually keep an eye on a variety of variables, I think. I'll be subject to correction on this. And in your private messaging, if it looks like morphologically like you are somebody that is grooming a kid and you are an adult and you're about to try to do something terrible, it can sort of flag that behavior and go after it. And in some ways, those are the very tools that also help know to advertise dog food rather than cat food to you. You can see broadening that. You can see it here to get rid of a terrible scourge. You can see it in other jurisdictions through regulation or force being used to decide who's going to be a dissident today. Well, dissidents that did this are also like dissidents who did that, and therefore maybe you're a dissident. And with the amount of data available as things go digital, it's easier and easier to start to form judgments about people, even in their own living room. This is a wonderful Microsoft patent where in Soviet Russia, TV watches you. And there is the TV watching you, and they can use it to charge you more if more people want to watch the thing, and you're left having to hide under the couch if you want to save a few bucks, which is kind of like clipping coupons. That's the system working as far as doing the kind of price discrimination they might want to do. Now, the fear of this might be that wrong judgments will be made. I will be misjudged as a lout or whatever it is when I'm not at all. And this is represented by this wonderful Amazon UK perfect partner suggestion by the official LEGO Creator Activity book with American Jihad, the terrorists living among us today. I don't think I'm going to buy the official LEGO Creator Activity book anymore, but it's the kind of thing that I don't know if I'm more worried about it being wrong or about it being right. It's kind of which is worse in some ways as we see the very power of these networks. And you also see the way, as soon as the power gets known, that's when SEO comes in around the edges. So here's a Craigslist, very 1.0 thing, but we need you to attend a public meeting. We'll give you $50 in lunch if you come to a public meeting with a shirt that says America counts on coal. So it's like human SEO walking into the room and spamming, and not easy to see, well, are these all people who are counting on coal? Or they kind of are counting on coal in the sense that coal paid them to show up at the meeting. But that's the kind of thing where, in some ways, the magic and power of this gets lost the more we can quantify, measure, and channel the power of it. It's this weird kind of paradox, kind of like placebo, where placebos can work really well. One of the fundamental insights of, I think, what has become behavioral economics. But placebos, as soon as you know why they're working, they don't work as well. I'm not going to, spoiler alert, I'm not going to tell you the secret to a placebo. But it turns out they're very powerful, but they rely on ignorance in order to retain their power. So just 2 minutes or less on what are some approaches to deal with some of these more structural worries about new institutions mediating between behavioral economics and social media. And for that, this is, I think, a very recent announcement where we have announcements of more transparency of some of that secret sauce. And I think, modulo the placebo observation, it's a very good thing to have people know, and they'll kind of, the hackles will sink as they can say, all right, I get the idea. This is roughly, if not the precise algorithm, what you're trying to do with this and why. And I have a chance to assess what's going on before I decide whether to continue within whatever umbrella I am with that mediating institution. So extremely positive to have disclosure. Positive to think of ways to allow for not just all or nothing opt-out, don't go to the pub if you don't want to be fingerprinted, but almost, individual opt-outs so that people can say, this is a stream of data, telemetry I don't want to include in whatever judgments are going to get made, either to reflect back on myself or to make recommendations to other people. And also possibly some form of what I've called reputation bankruptcy. Some way of being able to reset all the counters. Say, today you are a man. You get to reset all of your Facebook kind of accumulated stuff. I'm not sure you'd want to be able to do it every day, but having an opportunity every interval to start with a clean slate, there's reasons why it might make sense in the financial realm. If it's worth it for money, it might be worth it for information too. And finally, there's a fascinating paper that says that after a political accommodation was made at the elite level, our biggest and most standard institutions in the mid-19th century about slavery, namely that fugitive slaves would be returned to the South, even though the North at the time did not support slavery, it became dead letter. Because whenever the posse was called, it had to be more peer-to-peer. Law enforcement was not as professional as it is today. There weren't as many standing peace officers. So if you needed to do something, you'd have to call upon the populace and raise a posse. And it turns out that when you tried to get a posse to return fugitive slaves, they were busy shampooing their cats. They just weren't, sorry, I can't make it. And slaves couldn't be returned as easily because in this peer-to-peer analog social network way, people weren't in favor of it. And thinking about how to, I think Eliot called it the democratization and maintaining that of these institutions is to me the way of trying to keep the power of the distributed peer-to-peer social media still down there. And it's what Cass, I think, called the serendipity, the surprise, the fact that none of us actually can figure it all out precisely because there are so many people, so many variables, so much going on, that there's going to be emergent feelings from that crowd. And the fact that we can't predict it will mean we're also not going to try to game it. Thank you very much.
Okay, there's been a ton that's been said, and one of us has to teach a class in 4 minutes, yours truly, so I'm going to turn it over to Professor Zittrain momentarily. But just a couple of brief thoughts that I think all of the comments actually suggest. One is that you can imagine a social architecture of choice, and you can imagine a social architecture of serendipity. So your network can be something that you have thoroughly controlled the content of. Or it can be one that has serendipitous encounters with people, cultures, ideas, politics. And Jane Jacobs' great book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, is really a poem almost to the architecture of serendipity. Though a life that doesn't have control in it would have many problems, among them inconvenience. I think all of the comments were emphasizing the value and uses of an architecture of control, but also pointing to the occasional values of serendipity. The second idea has to do with disclosure, and as the Yelp context suggests, and many things on Twitter and Facebook suggest, disclosure can be an extremely powerful tool for knowing stuff and improving things. So a great power in disclosure is that the people whose imperfections are disclosed, or the institutions, can do better by virtue of that fact. Justice Brandeis said sunlight is the best of disinfectants.
Quite literally in the case of Yelp.
Yeah, so this is the kind of beauty of disclosure as a nudge. But I think Jay-Z's comments suggest there's some downsides, one of which is entrenchment. So if there's someone who's misbehaved, say, and you know that, they can be entrenched and kind of stuck in their own misbehavior in a way that's hard to get out of. That's an extremely interesting idea about a potential harm by even truthful disclosure. And the last little thought is, most of the comments are about the power of choice architecture. So if you go into a grocery store or a restaurant, there's an architecture there, literally, but there's an architecture of choice. What do you see first? And Google, I know, has recently redesigned its cafeterias in a way that's been specifically targeted to the obesity problem. And it's actually showed great results by changing what people see first and what's most convenient. So those who provide social networks, and the government too, are on occasion choice architects, however much they try to maintain neutrality. And I guess Jay-Z's suggestion is neutrality is, in many contexts, really the right aspiration. Though some of the cases we've discussed suggest that there's potential for good things, like saving lives, which maybe don't fall completely within the domain of the neutral. So I have personal thanks to everybody, but I don't want applause. I want the discussion to continue. So thanks to you all, thanks to the panelists, and wish me well in administrative law, where I'm going.
Well, in the few minutes we have left, we should open it up to questions. So let's see if there are any. We have our mic wranglers roaming the aisle. Singular, I suppose.
So in the scenario you were describing, where you could imagine a world where sort of augmented reality, like people are giving feedback in particular ways about their peers and their activities, it begins to feel a little bit like, first of all, ubiquitous surveillance, and like we all just become Big Brother unwittingly. And I wonder what you think about how to avoid how to go about avoiding a sort of unwitting totalitarianism
Yeah, it's weird. It's a weird form of distributed totalitarianism. It's total in the sense of almost every act in your life is something now that has ramifications beyond the scope of your arm. It might be something that you're choosing to tweet or to otherwise emote. It's something then that can come back and help your accounts for your beauty or your fame and that kind of thing. And we already see it. I mean, I don't mean to be too quick about it to say it links back to reality TV, the sorts of commentary when you see people plucked out of obscurity or even left in obscurity. Don't worry, we'll come to you. The cameras come to them, and of course the presence changes things. And what to do about it, I'm not sure, especially because I think often by the time it happens, when you ask the people if they mind, or in fact if they openly desire it, they will say they don't mind and they do desire it, and then who are we to tell them they're not entitled to it? I think talking about it honestly has the effect maybe of dispelling the effect of the placebo, so it can be useful truly to reflect on it and figure out who we want to end up being, what do we want to end up wanting, and also to design things so that at least it's very easy to do some piecemeal, off the record, I'm shutting down now, I'm retaining a certain physical sphere. To make that really easy to do could be good for those who are designing the platforms that are also trying to make it really easy to make those information flows happen. And I should see if others have reactions on this or anything.
I think the only point that I'd make is I don't know if it's that new a phenomenon. You know, I think it's actually more new the opposite direction. There was a time and place when everybody lived in a small, you know, in relatively small communities, and people were in everybody's business. Now, maybe the reaction to that was geographic mobility, but I don't think, you know, these are not all new phenomena.
Scale maybe matters, though.
Yeah, it might be a difference in degree becomes a difference in kind. There's also some phenomena where because there are a lot of people in the world, but there can be a phenomenon that goes viral. If it goes viral because there's a certain measure of outrage or humiliation associated with whatever it is, the person who is the subject of it can be subject to that blowback that in the village might make sense. You did this, the village knows, they say shame on you, and then unless it's Hester Prynne, they move on. Right. Whereas in Facebook or the internet more generally, something can go viral in a way that that momentary outrage is momentary for the outrager, but continuous. And I forget the guy from Yale who did some kind of video resume that made him look.
But see, I think that, but interestingly, I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
You forgot the guy, you know.
Yeah.
Who's the guy? That's,
that's the thing. I forgot, but he didn't. Like,
yeah.
He. Yes. Yes. Sorry, Elliot.
No, I completely agree that this is a phenomenon, and,
Yes.
and it raises all sorts of interesting and challenging questions. I'm actually more. I found, you know, I have to remember this. You know, you sort of say the provocative thing and then you run off to class. That's, you know, it's a good thing to remember. I think that, you know, I found very provocative his point at the end. I think it's a tension. You know, Emac and I haven't talked about it, but I'm sure they feel it at Twitter just as we do. It's this tension between neutrality and intervention. And you know, the organ donation example is an example of intervention.
Yeah.
And you know, the idea that we would weigh in favor of a political candidate would obviously be another example. We struggle very, very much in trying to remain a neutral platform. Obviously, we want to, and I think part of what's interesting is it would be interesting, particularly this community, to see whether you all agree that there are opportunities for intervention. Who should be the interveners? We're not sure we, as the intermediary, should be the intervener, and that's why I was mentioning and highlighting the role of our platform, so that other people can leverage our platform in ways they think are desirable, and then participate.
And I'm actually less enamored of a very simplistic view of neutrality that Cass attributed to me than he thinks. Because neutrality, when it's just like, we're just going to let it flow through, that can become unmanageable. Right. There might be a version of Twitter I would like where my tweets are more gradated in ways that are kind of AI governed. But it would be good first to have an opportunity for third-party apps to make their own formulae, and then I can choose among them. And second, it would be nice to know roughly how that's working. In particular, are there outside influences that have less to do with helping me out and more to do with
helping us out?
Yeah, exactly. And that's not, it might be a form of neutrality, but it's not the simplistic neutrality that I'd assume. I'd also say it would be great to let people, when they are implicated by a meme going around, to have some privilege in adding something to it or expressing a view about it. So if there's Star Wars Kid and that's getting passed around, name your modality, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, if I could identify myself, not personally identified, but say, yes, I'm that kid, and can I just ask, please don't forward it. I know it's funny, I feel awful, I'm 14, I didn't put it online, my frenemies did. You could see people at least being confronted with the moral choice and having a chance to make a moral choice about it, rather than just saying, funny kid here is the same as a funny cat there. Alex, you were gonna...
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to add there was I think this neutrality versus point of view argument, a lot of it depends on being able to see yourself as the opposition. And I think one of the best examples of this I've seen recently was the way a lot of the internet companies acted in the SOPA fight. And to be fair, I think I would bet almost everybody in this room was very happy with the way the internet companies came, for the most part, out of neutrality in order to join that fight.
And by out of neutrality, you mean they used their own particular platforms to promote their political view.
Yep, and we were one of the ones that didn't, but you
were
would...
also one of the ones that really didn't, and for precisely the kinds of reasons that you were suggesting.
So you're saying rhymes with schnoogle.
Well, I mean, you look at this same room in LA, has a very different view about the lessons learned from SOPA and about the benevolence of the platforms that
Which would be that these platforms could turn on us at any moment and kind of unfairly, because they say these platforms have themselves to rely upon.
Yeah, and I think that's the when Elliot talks about the worry about stepping away from neutrality, that is very much.
And it calls to mind. I mean, Elliot was saying everything new is old again. It calls to mind when broadcast, which hasn't been around that long, broadcast ends up really powerful mass media, and then we have a fairness doctrine that's like, for every 10 minutes you talk about extolling this pipeline, you've got to also have 10 minutes saying the pipeline sucks. And then we get rid of the fairness doctrine because that's government regulation of privately held companies.
But I thought, again, I don't know, and again, I think there are people here who know more about that. But my sense is, I thought the fairness doctrine went away because they felt there were other opportunities for...
The mass media was less powerful, although it's interesting, they got rid of it long before the internet was sort of in the public eye. And that also gets back to third-party apps and other ways to be able to have your data used not just by the platform, but by those who would ride along with the platform. We're really over time, so I think we're going to have to stop. But maybe stick around a little bit if people want to chat afterwards. So I think I've been given the solemn duty by Cass to say thank you all for coming, and cheers.
That was an excellent